presentation is experimental representations in South African women's fiction, particularly focusing on the experimentation and erotic representations in Bessie Head's Question of Power. Bessie Head, actually born today, 6 July 1937, so it's her birthday today. To a white mother and a black man, her parents' identities were foreign and remained like that in the shape and form for her to commemorate in staggered narratives for the rest of her writing life, except the domineering narrative being that she came into terms is the bewildering knowledge that her mother suffered from acute madness, in which she was hospitalized for a mental hospital in Pietermaritzburg she refers to in the novel A Question of Power as the Red House, a crass building she had often walked past it as a child, never dreaming that her own life was so closely linked to its life. Her father, a mystery black man, and Edgar, the young Bessie Head, could only be filled with speculative narratives, as maybe that he was a gardener in a home in which his position in society was that at the point of racial discrimination, already beneath, weak, and a nobody, as how the contemporary apartheid South Africa subjugated and othered black people. That was to become a haunting factor her whole life in the ways in which she felt it was necessary for her to reimagine herself from a locus of not belonging, a woman alone, having to experiment for survival. Head, by way of experimentation as a colored woman, seeking to write herself out of misery caused by the apartheid South Africa, wanted to be free from the harsh experiences of South Africa, as she was not proud of her biological and politically textured background. Dobrota Puchereva states that her open quote shame was particular to her own so-called colored identity as a product of not just cross-race, cross-class sexuality, but a sexuality between a black man and a white woman who, by coupling with a representative of the tainted race, symbolically sullied the entire white femininity as sexually deviant, close quote. Head, as we have seen in the novel by Lusinkosi Mating Beds, that focuses on a black man's narration in a prison cell, awaiting a death sentence. This narration of Ngisibia's captivity is a result from desiring a white woman, when by the nature of the law could not be an experience at a physical level, except only from a voyeuristic, which was in concord with the argument which highlights the Immorality Act of 1950 motive to ban any relations between whites and non-whites, and controls the ways in which bodies related and what bodies could get up to, castigating blacks and whites in an erotic desire. Head then, in this departure from speaking a bit about Lusinkosi's Mating Beds, becomes the actual product. Head then becomes the actual product of unwarranted love, desire, and lust, as accentuated in Nkosi's novel. As the Nationalist Party during apartheid imposed and implemented hefty laws that impacted the ways in which the nation relates to sex and reproduction. This shame that Pucherova is referring to pivots one of the reasons Head left the country on a one-way exit to Botswana when she was only 27 years old, and also a single mom to a small boy, to never look back, as she felt she did not belong to either groups in the country, white or black, and needed a fresh start outside of the brutal reality South Africa was. I argue and will reveal in this paper that was part of experimenting to defy the discriminatory nature of apartheid required, especially to women. This paper focuses on experimental representations in South African fiction and studying Bessie Head's third and last novel, A Question of Power. The central argument is concentrated on the various ways women must experiment in their writing lives as a potential for creative ways of breaking free from the patriarchal grab, but also to give new definitions to what writing meant or means for women in particular, especially their characterization. I argue that Heads, A Question of Power, which was published in 1973, was not only experimentation of textual dexterities, but also as a way of life and being, as a way to create a new reality by leaving the oppressive country completely. My paper is divided into two sections. The first will look at how Bessie Head's experiments in A Question of Power are a way to imagine new ways of storytelling that do not conform to the heteronormative patriarchal world. The subversions Bessie Head carries out in the method of in the methods of narrative, form, and content. The second and last section of this paper will look at Bessie Head's accidental erotic moments in A Question of Power as part of experimenting with sexuality. To give context to South African women's writing, Barbara Boswell, in an article titled Overcoming the Daily Pledging by Apartheid, Black South African Women Writers, Agency and Space, locates writing under apartheid as seeking, open quote, to transcend the apartheid state's conception of theme as mere objects, but to succeed as published writers who can create literary worlds and legacies, close quote. Boswell goes on to coin that these writing women were creatively revisioning the state of being as this medium of expression was and readily exercised by men. And these were the likes of Lucy Nkosi, Eskiam Pahlele, Mongani Walisirote, Dennis Brutus, and Alex Laguma, and many more. By, open quotes, creatively revisioning, close quotes, she means that Black women had to go beyond what was prescribed as a permitted expression, but to creatively reconstruct element of agency for their literary creativity. She asserts that writers such as Miriam Tladi, Noni Jabavu, and Loretta Ngobo were in defiance of what the representation of apartheid demanded from them as women, especially Black, that is to be shut off, muted, and to lack agency, and not effectively translate what you discern at the bodily level into the scope of the text. The landscape of Black women's writing, as best noted by Mante Pahlele, is fundamentally a gesture of defiance, exercised by people, open quotes, striving to tell their stories within a political milieu which legislated against not only their survival, but their very being, close quote. Boswell and Pahlele seem to have a conversation and consider about the ways these early female writers consciously decided to take up on the autobiographical genre to bring to open quotes light lives interlaced with hardship, misery, and pain, and all of which jockeyed for position with an insatiable hunger and zest for life. Although for them at the time, this meant fictionalizing their lives, which in the country's tumultuous political climate was nothing short of witnessing the gore, everyday bloodshed, the Black life slaughter, continuous loss of the Black life as meaningless, which under the word rule became ordinary as nothing spectacular, as the Boer was undeviating in that kind of enforcement. What stands clearly is that by telling their lives, they demonstrated an act of courage and resilience, quoting Mpahlele. Basically, by narrating the psychosocial dramas of apartheid indelible on paper from a woman's perspective, they were retrospectively establishing literary ways of creating national consciousness by, open quote, providing and making a record of an alternative history of the country, by introducing new discourses that enabled them to negotiate communion with political power and influence, close quote. Both these authors I've mentioned makes reference to the South African canonical literacy works, such as those by Miriam Tladi's Muriel in Metropolitan, Noni Jabavu's Drawn in Color, Sindiwe Magona's To My Children's Children, Loretta Ngobo's Cross of Gold, that these works were, open quote, a need for passing knowledge from generation to generation as resisting the abominable system by penning about the harsh realities of being Black and female in apartheid South Africa. So that was just the context, and now in the paper, I move into speaking about Behr's Head's alternative ways of imagining. Behr's Head's experimentation that I want to focus on is illustrating how she, in a way, had a conversation with these women I've mentioned, but also transcended women's literary position in South Africa by choosing to go further than her female peers and counterparts. By this time, she had left South Africa and settling in Seruwe, a village in Botswana, wherein she documents the tenacious feelings of being in and unfamiliar, as we have seen in her works, Seruwe, Village of the Rainwind, and The Collector of Treasures, and other Botswana village tales. Although in the novel, A Question of Power, she takes on a different turn, a rampant experimentation throughout the novel. This body of work has been defined by many scholars and writers as not only as a challenging text with deeply layered meaning, but mostly the ranging themes being that of analyzing it or associating closely to madness. Margaret E. Tucker, in discussing madness in the African novel by Femi Odo-Adjun, in relation to Behr, taps into the ways systematic oppression exercised in colonized societies perpetuates physical violence and could lead those oppressed into moments of beholding madness. Tucker quotes Odo-Adjun stating that, open quote, the master-slave relationship that exists in a society, a relationship that has been adopted and carried forward into the neo-colonialist structure of the independent society, provides a classical setting for the dissipation of sanity and its replacement by dementia. And this applies, as Tucker highlights, to racism as well, apartheid, and other humanizing ideologies. However, in the ways my arguments are structured for this paper is not much to dwell or to enter into a question of power as protagonist's brain, Elizabeth, to wander for psychological diagnostics, but rather to immerse myself in the textual madnesses that occur in the text, about the ways the author implants virtuosic textual possibilities that sparks one to begin thinking what experimenting with tech means, or at least meant, for women in South Africa. As we learn that this heroine in a question of power, which is Elizabeth, and in relation to Behr's Head herself, is a half-breed, exiled from South Africa and into Botswana, a stranger in her own homeland, and still a stranger in a place she would like to call a new home. A low breed, a bastard, daughter of a male woman. Her non-identity, statelessness, chronic loneliness, and life on the verge of her terrestrial hell added to her inherited mental anguish and to make her a logical guest of the madhouse. Upon the novel's publication, she had been living in Botswana for 9 years, yet still not feeling like she belongs anywhere, and I'm quoting this from the 1976 Gaboroni's Writers' Workshop in which she attended. And this was Behr's Head saying, I have so often been referred to as the Botswana writer, which in reality, that Botswana personality isn't as violent as me. I could not be considered a South African writer in exile, but as one who has put down roots in Botswana. And yet, certain themes I am likely to write about have been mainly shaped by my South African experience, end quote. In this paper, I also try to dislodge Head from nationalistic bindings, as I find them very limiting, but draw attention to the ways Head undertook the double task of dismantling not only the racist discourse of South Africa, but also the racist masculinist elements of the available anti-apartheid discourse of her time, in an attempt to create an alternative narrative that her dissident identity was as a writer. And now to focus on the experimentation in the novel. A Question of Power begins in its experimentation with content by weaving the two societies, that of Botswana, as we see with the two male figures, Silo and Dan, who are Botswana, and the second part, which is the South African, and those are her biographical details that are extensively eloquent in the novel. By combining these two geographical narratives, interchangeable, unpredictable, instinctual, arbitrary, without anticipation, what Head is doing, she's giving suspense a new language of not being drawn in by previous intensity, but with every new sentence, paragraph is a different breath, that which is gratingly experimental, in a way where the experience of South Africa pause anew in Behr's life, but also in the protagonist's life, Elizabeth, in Botswana. Hence, A Question of Power is deliberate about its innovative literariness, as the author follows in the descriptions in Meg Saunders' article. And this article, it's called Autofiction, Autobiographiction, Autofabrication, and Heteronymity, differentiating versions of the autobiographical, wherein he mentions the turn writers had to take, writers like Bessie, in elevating their writing, whereby the autobiography now transforms as writers began to see the disadvantages of writing blanket summaries of their lives and comprehensive lists of events, the messiness involved in such a project, the inevitable incompleteness, the lack of an arc. But as we see in A Question of Power, as Bessie Head is doing in the novel, she is framing autobiographies, selecting experiences that would contribute to an overall narrative shape of their choosing. And these works, they make use of memories, mishaps, and strangeness as they record their lives. And these books, in how also I think about A Question of Power, these books, they bring us into thinking about autofiction and memoir, how you weave those two. I argue that it is not madness per se that solely engulfed Elizabeth, but rather the act of the author's remembering pain, patriarchal apartheid South Africa, and of not thinking about fiction and biographical details as two separate realities dwelling each other, but rather bleeding onto each other in messy ways. Of Head's ability to challenge the reader from distinguishing who is Elizabeth and who is Bessie Head in the novel. Of making your story your own by proffering alternative narrative possibilities. Of understanding that as we experiment, we make and give new definitions and knowledges. When I think about the article that I was referring to, in relation to Head's vocation of these innovative literary devices that set her apart from other South African women writers, and reveals experimentation story as a necessary mode of expression. As James M. Garrett has stated about the political nature of Head's narration, that it does, open quote, not become a substitution of or an effacement of ordinary reality by some ideal realm, but rather a transformation that seeks and aims to deliver the libido or the desiring self from the anxieties of oppressed reality. Head's experimentation in a novel is careful and deliberate. It is protesting what female writing is, or what it was understood in the 70s, and what it meant for women, or continues to mean for women in the region. In Sexual Textual Politics, Feminist Literary Theory, Toril Moy speaks about Helen Sixu's, open quote, imaginary utopias, close quote, about the ways writing must, open quote, split open the closure of the binary opposition and revel in the pleasures of open-ended textuality, close quote, to dismantle the binary logic of feminine writing from the androcentric writing. Moy also highlights the dangers of confusing the sex of the author with the sex of the writing he or she produces. From Mo's thinking in relation to Head's novel, it is apparent that she was not thinking about writing as a feminine or masculine position, but rather to position experimental writing, experimenting with form, characterization, content, and narrative as centering those on defying known and existing rules of writing in order to create new rules that could also in the present moment be revised. The novel illustrates how experiment or experimenting should not be read as a random jumbling or disorganization of text on paper, but as a complicated act of seeking to vividly portray, and by this using textual dexterities, the rigor of a scientific lab, wherein the conduct by the scientist and in literature, that is the author, prioritizes testing, exploring, venturing, innovating for new possibilities of knowledge production. As much as in the novel, Silo and Nedine are the two important men in Elizabeth's life. I'm still just 3 more pages.
If you can get through them.
I'll try to quickly. It's just 3 more pages. I haven't spoken to the experimenting with eroticism that I feel like I also want to share a bit.
Okay, so you've got 1 more minute. Maybe you can just jump ahead to that point. Yeah.
So in this last session, I also speak about how Bessie Head experiments with eroticism in the novel. So Head's experimentation with eroticism in the novel is in linking points, deliberate in writing as a way to give effect to the character's qualities. At the same time, Head's erotic moments are accidental. These therefore interlink and interact with each other to create a grey area fraught from moral judgment and ethical questioning, while simultaneously producing a tabooed space that elicits deep sexual tension and excitement in people's imaginations. For example, right at the beginning of the novel, and that is page 5, Head uses unambiguous sex-related language to give the reader dense personality. She wrote, "He had been standing in front of her, his pants off guard. He had been standing in front of her, his pants down as usual, flaying his powerful penis in the air and saying, 'Look, I'm going to show you how asleep we'd be. She has a womb I can't forget. When I go with a woman, I go for 1 hour. You can't do that, you haven't got a vagina.'" Close quote. The author takes to the consciousness of Dane, of how he views himself in society, of his pornographic imagination, which is centered around objectifying, dominating another subject, of sexual penetration of the mind as diminishing a woman's mind, of deleting what she is once a vagina is omitted, of erasing the very essence of her. Head, in the coming sentence from the same page, yet again counters Dane's position, and she wrote, "Love isn't like that. Love is two people mutually feeding each other, not one living on the soul of the other like a goal." The moral confusion when it comes to these two that I've spoken about features mainly arise from a common inability to define boundaries for appropriateness, and that is what constitutes as appropriate and what does not. Feminists have long discussed what features of sex have the potential of being tools of oppression, and so I join this tradition of politicizing the sexual imagination by integrating it. Okay, my time is already out.
You can finish your
The feminists have long.
You had 9 minutes.
Huh?
You had 9 minutes.
You just like your 2 minutes.
Feminists have long discussed what features of sex have the potential of being tools of oppression, and so with these ideas, I joined this tradition of politicizing the sexual imagination by integrating it with experimentation, and even propose disconnecting from Dan's type of objectification in favor of the erotics. Hence, I mentioned earlier that Head's sex scenes become these accidental erotic moments. First, objectification is a term coined by Andrea Dawkins, one of my favorite pornographic.
Maybe we can revisit the rest of your examples in the Q&A. Okay, I just wanted to give you enough space to at least get through one example. Okay, but thank you very much. Yes, so in the interest of time, thank you for loaning us 2 minutes in advance. Edgar Nabutanyi from Makerere University. And a very surprising topic, I might add, maybe one of the few other people in this room who would have remarked this, the smell of apples. Surprisingly and interestingly, Edgar is going to offer an innovative feminist critique or reading of the novel. So over to you.
Thank you, Nedine, and thanks to everyone for giving me audience. I'm going back to an old book, a book perhaps that in the literary circles we feel we have exhausted. First published in Afrikaans in 1993 and translated into English in 1995. Behr's Munemo has secured its place in the post-apartheid South African literary canon because of its brilliant exposition of how apartheid indiscriminately violated and oppressed those it was ostensibly thought to protect and privilege. The main narrative is set in the 1970s African Cape Town and documents the protagonist's parroted views of an Afrikaner racist ideology. Interpassed within the main narrative are wartime diary extracts of how a now mature protagonist comes face to face with Rita Bernard has described as the banality of apartheid. And I want to pause here and make 2 points about this novel. One is that there is a consensus in reading this novel, especially in terms of the infirmity of the author himself, and therefore critics like Rita Bernard and Sarah Nato, concentrate on a former apartheid security police spy, trying to justify and claiming that he and other South African white men and women were oppressed by the same system. And so you have, a thread of reading, the smell of apple that goes into that direction, that tries to link the person of the author, his infirmity, and the kind of work he's doing. But of recent, there has been focus on sexuality as a political comment. And here we have, scholars like Stobie, Medley, and many others who look especially at a bisexual rape by the father figure in the novel, to make several arguments about how the novel uses sexuality as a commentary about apartheid and as commentary about the heteropatriarchal oppression that the system engaged. Now, all this is insightful reading, but looking back at this novel, I noticed that there seemed to be a blindness to a feminist reading of the text, in the sense that most critics do not pay attention to 3 women in the novel who are protesting how they are treated. And that is why I'm suggesting a feminist reading of the novel. And basically, my tentative thinking is around the techniques that Behr uses to expose the oppression of women in this African society. And I propose that one of the techniques is the eavesdropping child narrator, manners in the novel. And in a subtle, unintended eavesdropping manner, he, reveals the kind of oppression that is going on. The second technique is letter writing, and here I'm particularly interested in the long letter that Aunt, what is her name, writes to her, the long letter that the younger sister writes to the elder sister, and explaining why she thinks she's being oppressed. So I will focus on 3 incidents in the novel. One is, again, Manas, the protagonist, reveals to the readers the secret activities that he and his sister have with their mother. And these include, one, the mother, playing the piano and singing in the shower when the father is not around. The second revelation is that she plays jazz in the car when she's going to pick the children from school. And the third revelation is that she visits her sister even when the husband has decreed that she should not visit her sister. And related to that, Manas also reveals to us that his mother, has not told her grandparents that the sister, whose name is running out of me, that her sister does not only put on trousers, but she also smokes. So my reading of this revelation is that here is, we have the voice of an innocent child narrator who is revealing to us fundamental, subversion of heteropatriarchal dictates. One, for example, the wife is, disobeying the husband is ordered not to visit the sister because they have disagreed politically. But also in not reporting what the quote unquote the behaviors of her sister, i.e. smoking and putting on trousers in the 1970s African society. This would be subversive actions, not only questioning African patriarchy, but also somehow, exhibiting a rejection of this ideology. Interestingly about the music, I want to make 2 points. One is the mother is an accomplished opera singer who, because of marriage and because of the oppression I'm talking of in the African society, has been reduced to a stay-home mother. So that sacrifice is, my reading is that for an international singer to sacrifice her career to be a mother is an indictment on the African society that advocates for that. But in that indictment, there's also a liberational potential, especially in finding ways of singing, but also in the type of music she listens to, jazz, which for a long time has been associated with revolutionary tendencies. So even if society has, forced her to abandon her career, she finds a way of, keeping up, resisting by finding a way of not only enjoying the music, but also using the music as a liberational tool. My second example is, again, an eavesdropped conversation. In the family, there is a visiting general, and during the discussion, Erasmus, in a typical Massachusetts way, boasts of how they get married. and he tells the story of how Jwara was visiting the South African embassy, meets him, waits for him to graduate, and they come back to South Africa and they get married. The way the story is told is, brings out that idea that the woman has no say. And yes, we could be generous and say maybe she had decided to do that, but when the visiting general asks her if she regrets, her response is very telling. She laughs uneasily and takes a sip at a glass of wine. And I read this as, indicating the discomfort, but also the discomfort that she has to discuss how marriage and African society's definition of marriage has reduced her or has stopped her from that. Then the other episode is the quarrel between the two sisters, where the younger sister, tells the sister that she says that she would never get married because she has seen how marriage, kills the agency of a person, and then he condemns Erasmus, the husband, of how he mistreats Leonore. And of course they break up, and the next time we have this letter, which the sister does not read, but the children open and read it for us. And in reading that letter, the sister's message is, very expansive on what is wrong with the African society and how it is untenable, the way they treat women. And so from those 3 examples, I draw my conclusion that Behr is using the child narrator to eavesdrop on quote-unquote adult conversations to reveal how women are oppressed in this society. And those 3 examples show us different levels of oppression and liberatory tools that the oppressed woman employs to respond. And as I conclude, I just want to draw your attention to Elsie's, the daughter in the novel. After reading the letter and after experiencing their domestic workers' son being ill-treated by white men, when she's being installed as a prefect, she forces the cream of African society in Cape Town to sing the 3 stanzas of the national anthem then. And I argue that this act coming at the time it comes is subversive in 2 ways. One, showing how hollow the apartheid ideology is. And my argument is, if the white supremacists believed in the ideology, then how come they can't sing the 3 stanzas of their own national anthem? But in so doing, I argue that Elsie is revealing the hollowness of the system, but also the kind of violence that this system, that the people are not well versed with, ironically, this on the people it is intended to protect. I'll stop there for now. That's it.
Wow. Thank you. Okay, and so Edgar continues to be a benefactor of time. So, you can take the floor. While she's getting set up, Munemo is from University. representing Rose University, and she's presenting on Vashti, a play by Munemo. Is that correct? Okay.
Do we need to put all the language?
It's visible.
Can you move to the next slide and okay, just, if you put all the lights off, then we can't see you in the video. Are you okay with that? All right, then we can do it.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today I will examine the feminist play Vashti, which is adapted from the controversial biblical account of Queen Vashti, who is dethroned after she refuses to appear before her grand husband, King Ahasuerus, and his guests, wearing nothing but her crown. Her refusal to appear before the king is a violation of edicts against women appearing in the king's presence without being summoned, or refusing to answer when summoned. Dethroned for daring to refuse an instruction from the king and choosing to defend her dignity, she is a representation of the women who have dared to speak or defied, and have been struck down or villainized. In the Bible, Vashti appears in Esther 1, verse 1 to 21. Moonsamy play is a de-inscription and de-archiving of the official account. The retelling of Vashti's story speaks to the precariousness of male dominance and critiques the patriarchal fixation of maintaining control over women's bodies and minds. The wise men advised the king to replace Vashti and pass a law, anxious that Vashti's refusal would lead to women across the kingdom rebelling against their husbands. Ocon, with her play, pleads on Vashti's behalf, considers the reasons for her actions, and questions the wise men's counsel. So I will look at three things, which is Ocon's reason for writing text, how she writes Vashti differently from the biblical account, and how Esther, in the end, takes on Vashti's qualities as a queen. So my master's research focuses on young African writers in the digital space, and one of my chapters is centered around JLIT, which is the Journal of African Youth Literature. This is a non-profit project that was started by Munemo, born out of a multilingual literary and creative arts periodical that publishes creative writing, prose, plays, visual stories, as well as artworks by young African writers and artists. Readers can access the journal on Issue using their mobile devices and computers. Issue is basically a digital self-publishing platform where people can upload content and create interactive flipbooks or online documents. Users can also convert their documents to social stories, mobile optimized articles, and GIFs for social media. With JLIT, readers can download PDF versions of the journal and from the website as well. So JLIT's hashtag is African Stories Matter, and the motto is preserving African youth identities. The play appears in the 5th edition of JLIT. The digital periodical also makes room for young adults to question how history has always been told. Ocon does this by questioning the original account of Vashti and giving a revised narrative of Queen Vashti's tragic story. So in the introduction to the text, Ocon and Behr, who she wrote the text with, they write, "History is told by the victors, or at least by those who get a platform, and these are generally men with an agenda. With relatively few ancient Roman writers known, and under a serious study as the vast majority of religious, philosophical, and historical texts, it is no wonder women still face sexism and paternalist justifications. We have precious few reports we can be sure were written by women about women and life in general." So this is one of the reasons that Ocon wrote the text, to present a different version of history and an imagining of what Vashti experienced. Another reason that she wrote the text is because few have thus far pleaded on Vashti's behalf, cared to consider the reasons for her actions, or question the wise man's counsel. After 2,500 years, Vashti points to the terrible injustice and damage done by such patriarchal stories. So I will start my discussion at the end of the play. Vashti has just been banished from the palace and has been living in a cave, vulnerable to attacks and assaults from the outside world. Her loyal eunuchs have snuck out of their palace duties to visit her. Vashti has been suffering, and in this scene, she says her last words and actually dies. So I'll just repeat what she says. The king has moved on. I too shall move. I was the author of my fate, and I've stayed faithful to it. It is while you came this day, and do not have another to spare. Let the king live forever, innocent and with his word graved in stone, but let me be swept unto the margin of history. If it is else, I will be too remembered, and my name used as a sharp point for staking wives to the ground. Prithee, love my precious ones, but do not tell them of me. Let them be happy, and think not of me, and you do not recall me. Speak not of me. Now I shall wander and deviate from the page of history. Draw the veil across, and do not look, my friends, how I go. So in this, we see that Vashti wishes to be forgotten and swept into the margins of history, afraid that what she has done will always be held against women or wives who are defiant. Indeed, she is swept to the margins and labeled an evil queen. The response to her defiance is a reflection of the disposability of women in the Persian patriarchal society. But the mute always speak. Okan takes it upon herself to speak on Vashti's behalf and to present a rehabilitated view of Vashti. While Vashti fought as hard as she could have for herself, Okan continues the fight through the play. Reimagining Vashti's experience exposes and critiques the patriarchal fixation of maintaining control over women's bodies and minds. In patriarchal societies of later periods, the obscuring of Vashti's existence is used to push the idea of subservience and docility in order to maintain control over women. Something that is very significant is Vashti had the only true claim to the throne. She was Belshazzar's surviving heir and the great-granddaughter of King Nebuchadnezzar. From a young age, she was designated a suitable wife for the Emperor Ahasuerus. Some scholars argue that Ahasuerus held the banquet as a coup to dethrone the queen because he was only king by marriage. He used his advantage as a man to gain power and to make sure that all the men in the kingdom had that sense of power too. Similarly, Jewish leaders in later periods have used her story to push the idea of subservience and docility. When Vashti refuses to appear in front of the king, his advisors tell him to divorce her and throw her out immediately. All eyes are on her. While Ahasuerus gathers the men, she has gathered the women of the royal household. The wise men feel threatened because her refusal to appear before the king would encourage the women in the kingdom to defy their husband. Her refusal also dismantles male dominance, reducing Ahasuerus to anger. With advice from his wise men, the law is passed. Wives shall give their husbands honor. She must withstand great or small abuse and let him have none. And with this we can see that the men were already afraid because the women had valid reasons to rebel. Of course, the law could not be enforced, but the villainizing of Vashti is successful. The Babylonian Talmud, which is a commentary made by important rabbis on the Torah and Tanakh, which are Jewish texts, for instance, paints her as an evil queen who beats her maids and ultimately gets what she deserves. A kind of prelude to the triumphant ending of the book of Esther. But I would argue that she actually paves the way for Esther's triumph, which will be my third point later in the discussion. Okan represents Vashti as a noble, thoughtful, and well-intentioned woman, admired and loved by her servants, and wise in her dealing with royal matters. The palace is chaos without her guidance on royal and political matters, and there is no joy on the face of the palace inhabitants. Wendy Amsterdam argues that women in religion are constantly confronted with taboo images of dangerous women from whom we are told to distance ourselves. A A is too radical, B has gone too far, C has made too many enemies. But the women from whom we may distance ourselves as a result of authoritative or traditional religious teachings have a lot to share. Out of all of the reasons scholars and religious teachers have used for Vashti's refusal, some say that she just didn't feel pretty and didn't want to appear in front of the king. Some argue that she would parade for other men outside of the marriage and was just refusing to spite of her search. There's many different reasons that people give for her refusal. But out of all of the reasons in the play, Vashti chooses her own dignity and also to protect the king, fearing that he will make a fool of himself. When approached by the king's chamberlain, she asks him repeatedly what the state of the king is. She knows the king more than anyone, and knows that his drunkenness and choice of companions could lead to regrettable deeds. Persian kings were known to hold banquets and get so drunk that they would create rules or laws, and then would later abolish them. Yet in his foolishness, Opan's Vashti chooses to protect the hussars, which shows her sense of reasoning, nobility and loyalty to the throne, and also her understanding of her duties as queen. Her responses to his summoning are calculated, and she stands firm in her decision, knowing that she won't win either way, whether she goes to the king's court and appears naked with the crown on her head, or whether she refuses. So up there is just some of her subjects trying to convince her to make pageantry for the court, which to go and parade in front of the men. So Vashti's defiance then, I'm not going to read it for the sake of time, so you can just read. Vashti's defiance then is also in resistance to merely being a display object in the eyes of men. She is the killjoy of the male obsession with women's bodies, pageantry, and parading women as pretty objects in the kingdom. The king was a polygamist with many wives and concubines in his harem, but the queen was a special wife occupying a favored position. A call is sent out throughout the kingdom, so after Vashti refuses to appear before the king, and she's divorced, a call is sent out throughout the kingdom for all beautiful virgins to be gathered into the harem so that the king could choose a new queen from among them. As a member of the harem, a woman would technically be the property of the king, either as a wife or a concubine. Each of the women would spend a night with the king. After their night together, each woman would be moved to the other side of the harem and would never see the king again, unless he called for her. When he finds the right one, he names her queen, although she would not be his exclusive wife or sexual partner. A woman who was never called again would live her life in the harem as a pampered prisoner, with no possibility for a real marriage or a family of her own. The women in the pageant go through an extensive time of purification and beautification, which stands in stark contrast to Vashti's refusal. She casts a long shadow over the rest of the book of Esther, and the pageant seems almost silly and a petty and childish act of revenge, plotted by the king's wise men, who intend to replace Vashti as a political leader themselves, but still wanted a woman in the queen's position as something to parade. It is known that Ahasuerus regretted his decision to divorce Vashti, but was pushed by his advisors to hold a pageant where Esther was crowned queen. So in her article, Diva or Heroine, Judy Behr makes a list stating what Esther and Vashti have in common. So each queen was faced with a decision whether to accept or reject the role accepted of her. Each had to face the consequences of her decision. Esther to appear in the throne room unsummoned, and Vashti to fail to appear when she was summoned. So I'll just give a backstory for those who may not have read Esther, is that it was unknown that she was Jewish, and basically a law and edict had been passed that all Jews in the kingdom would be killed or attacked on a certain day. And so what she wanted to do was to protect her people and stand up to the king and ask that a different edict be passed where they could protect themselves. But because of the edict where you could not appear in front of the king without being summoned, to appear in front of him would risk her life. She could be killed or something else would happen to her. So both of them had to face the consequences of their decisions. Esther to appear in the third moon unsummoned, Vashti to fail to appear when she was summoned. Each woman had the unprecedented experience to have the ear of the king. Both violated his edicts, Vashti to preserve her modesty and Esther to save her people. I argue that Vashti just happened to be on the wrong side of the call. While the biblical text presents her as a plot device or a way for Esther to be crowned, I would call her a sacrificial lamb. Her dethronement paved the way for Esther to defy the king. Esther must confront the image of Vashti and incorporate, or perhaps discover, the attributes of Vashti herself to save the Jewish people in the kingdom. In a moment of crisis, where she must approach the king without being summoned, she does not look so much like the antidote to Vashti's defiance. She takes matters into her own hands and stands up to sources of authority. Like Vashti, she will appear before the king only when she decides that the time is right. And in this case, after 3 days of prayer and fasting. Her decision is both divinely inspired and a repetition of Vashti's bravery to break the law. Instead of following Mordecai's suggestions and simply making her petition to the king, she throws a series of parties as Vashti was known to do. And in order to succeed, Esther realizes that she must take on aspects of the repudiated former queen. Vashti is the killjoy who paves the way for the ultimate defiance. Vashti is the killjoy who paves the way for the ultimate defiance that saved the whole nation. Oakman understands that a creative revisionist project such as Vashti is dangerous, as it can be associated with heresy and dissidence. But as she argues in her introduction to the text, it is justified protest that is more urgent and necessary as feminists strive to revolutionize society. It is no coincidence that it has been men who continue to label Vashti evil, an evil, arrogant, and dissident queen. Women reason with her and try to learn from her and her defiance. Those who speak for Vashti insist that Esther should not be favored over Vashti, but Vashti should be given credit for the resistance that leads to Esther's triumph. The reimagining and retelling of Vashti's story is important because it symbolizes the rewriting of history from women's perspectives. It also highlights the importance of defiance in the face of injustice. 2,500 years ago, Vashti stood alone, but more women stand with her and learn from her today. And Okan's text stands as testament to that. It is an ode to the abandoned queen who kept her dignity and sacrificed her life, so that others like Esther might have a chance. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you for those wonderful papers. And so now we've got a nice window of time for questions. So I don't know if anybody would like to open the floor for questions. Dina?
I shouldn't, but I will. Thank you so much. I'm glad I was able to make it to this panel. I think each of the papers, you can see the ways in which they tie together in very interesting ways. So the very first paper in which you talk about Bessie Head and the ways in which the kinds of ways in which she uses that space of experimentation to articulate, right? You mentioned something around towards the end. You mentioned something about accidental. What did you call it? Accidental eroticism. I don't know. I would just want to hear a little bit more about that and how you see how it was working. And for you, Edgar, can I just say I'm impressed? You presented an entire paper without looking at your screen. I was tracking you. And it's quite impressive. And you mentioned 3 techniques where you talk about the child narrator, eavesdropping, you talk about letter writing, and there's a third one that I'm not quite sure I followed very well, and if you could just talk to that. I don't know, there was a third one. Just the two. Oh, okay, so that, me and my notes taking. And for you, I just want to thanks again for anything that kind of takes us back to the Bible. And I've looked at work on say Proverbs. Is it Proverbs 31? Is it 31 or 21? Yeah, that one. So I'm not too familiar with Vashti. I didn't even know she. I know of Esther. I'm not familiar with that. But then yeah. So it's interesting in the way that you revive her. And yes, you do talk to us about this space with these young people who reanimate these stories online, and I'm really curious to see what your thinking is in terms of connecting to existing feminist work on the Bible and these women, and what you think is happening with the kind of both shift in that online space, but also that it is being rewritten. It's an African space. Yeah. This is an African writing. What's happening there? I don't know if it's something that you can disentangle a little bit in the response. So.
Okay, maybe you can go with that round of questions. Yeah.
Thanks, Prof, for your question. So in how I'm thinking about eroticism in that manner is, and sort of coining it's accidental in the novel. It's in the way of how I read the sex scenes as they try to break free from the pornographic imagination, which is very centered around conquest, conquering someone. So where we become complicit as a reader in how we become complicit when we are watching pornography, because we are watching someone go through being drawn in, then lusted, entered, then conquered, and then discarded. Because after the ejaculation, it's finished. So in the sex scenes, it's just that I didn't get to where I was speaking about Medusa. So what Bessie here does is she'll be speaking about something, and then randomly she gives you this sex scene wherein you are not complicit as a reader seeing someone being objectified like that, but it's just inserted as a way to sort of give a definition of how the Medusa is like, or how Dan is like, or how Elizabeth is like. So I think of it as the eroticism of it becomes accidental rather than being this deliberate way of viewing women sexually, like pornography does, like how then it perpetuates this idea of dominance, domineering someone, but conquering someone sexually. Yeah. So that's why I think of it as these sex scenes are not very deliberate, where Dan is going on and on and on about Elizabeth or Silo, but more of it's just a sex scene that sometimes is not even in relation to the previous narration, but it's something that just appears accidentally. Yeah. Of course, some of the sex scenes in the novel are questionable. They're not always erotic. Like even with the example I made around portraying Dan as this guy flaying his penis, that on its own is very patriarchal in the sense of it's robust, it's so big, even in what he says. But then in how then I try and weave in the eroticism is then how exactly like after Dan flaying his penis like that, she tries and think about love is not like that, it is creating, because I think of eroticism as very deliberate in the sense of I'm making with you rather than I'm opening up for you to enter, but we are making something together, like as a way to break free from pornographic imagination.
I thought I was working with the two techniques, the eavesdropping, child narrator, and the letter writing.
The eavesdropping, the letter writing, yeah, the child narrator. And it also spoke very interestingly about music, which perhaps
No, things.
Yeah.
The things.
Yeah, well, precedence, yes. But we'll get back to that perhaps after thought.
Okay, to answer your question, this play, I would say, is a special play in the journal, because usually what they do is that they collect stories, plays, essays, artworks from young people across Africa that are related to their experiences right now, like in the present. So I think for her it was a special project that she took on, just trying to understand why Vashti would have been discarded in history. What is the reason for that? What were the motives? What are the motives behind the way that she is represented? And it is really she's presented as, you know, someone who's evil and arrogant and consistently spoken down upon, just to push the idea of, do not be defiant, you must be silent, you must be docile, otherwise, basically you won't survive. So she's always represented as this woman who, you know, the reasons for her defiance are never really considered, especially when you look at older criticisms of the text. And there's also so much more focus on Esther and her story, and not so much what happened to Vashti. She's just, I think there's 7 chapters in Esther, and out of that she's only 21 verses in 1 chapter. She's just used as a plot device, so I think she really wanted to explore more of Vashti's experience and her story and what she was going through. One of the main aims of the journal is for people to present stories of change and rethinking how things have happened historically and how young people are dealing with the after effects of things that have happened before. So I think for her it was really taking a story in the Bible and thinking about it for herself as a young woman in Africa now, and how it can be related to different African experiences. I think there's, in my research, there are some papers that have been written on Esther and Vashti and the relation to the African experience here, and how defiance and resistance is always kind of faced with violence and erasure. Yeah. Oh, and then, sorry, one other thing. So the writers don't really, I think they just submit their experiences, but for me, what interested me about the journal is just comparing scholarship and theories that I've learned and I've explored to the stories that are written. So I think their work kind of embodies different theories and scholarships, not on purpose, because they're really just submitting, you know, their creative works or their creative essays. But it's always interesting, the parallels to, the themes that you see in the sort of work that they submit.
So I guess one of the questions I have for Edgar, I haven't read the book, but I guess you saying that the women characters have not been given attention, and so that you're doing this feminist reading analysis of them. Why have the women characters been largely ignored? What would you theorize would be the reason that they've been largely ignored? And when you were speaking, I was thinking about, when you're talking about that character, and even though she's given up this international art career, that she's still singing in the home space. For me, it reminded me of Maya Angelou's I Know Why a Cage Bird Sings, right? Because it can. And so, I enjoyed you picking up on that, because then it relates to a whole lineage of other women who, despite their circumstances, not only voice it, but sing it. This is going up on Twitter. I think of eroticism as something I do with you, not that I'm opening up for you. That's definitely going on Twitter. And I'm also thinking in terms of Pearl's paper, because it's only recently that I came to know of the story of Lilith, and the fact that you know, she's supposedly the first woman that's created with Adam, right? But she wouldn't be submissive to him during sex, so she refused to lie under him, and so she left the Garden of Eden, even at the point of being cursed. And in someone like Kali, for instance, who is seen to ride Shiva, and sort of birth creations in that way. And so I just kind of thought it was interesting, your reading of sex versus eroticism, and the ways in which, I'm sorry, I've been in and out of for your paper, but I thought that was an interesting dimension, and how sex is often this point at which it stops with the man ejaculating. And so the ways in which, when women have agency in sex, the ways that, and I'm not talking about pornography again, because I think you had a whole thing that you were still going to speak about objectification there, but how, for instance, in the UK they ban any kind of porn where women ejaculate, because that's seen as peeing. And even I think it's as late as the 60s to the 80s that they even started to research something such as women's ejaculation, the possibility, and it's still not widely accepted. So I just thought that some of the things that you were saying there around eroticism, and relating that to kind of agency, for me, I wanted to hear more about, because when I think about Bessie Head, I'm not thinking those things, to be honest.
Would you like to respond?
Yeah, thank you for that reference to Maya. I will certainly look that up. Thank you very much on that. I can't speculate why, African literary criticism has not engaged with the feminist critique in Behr. I think it is a general belief that certain times, at certain moments, the topical issues, and its publication 93, 95, coincided with a momentous episode in African public discourses, and therefore, the author and his infirmity, the times around which the novel was published, endangered it to a more political reading, and that is why there's a lot of political reading of the novel exists. And then after that, after the rainbow moment and the truth and the reconciliation moment, we come to human rights and sexuality rights, and therefore there's another trajectory that goes into that direction. And I just feel maybe it is time to get back to this important text and look to issues or things that fell into the cracks. But certainly, if you were reading this novel in 95, 2000, the political resonance of the novel would take center stage. And, works like Rita Bernard, Sarah Nato, Strobe have, focused on that, because that was the critical sensibilities then were towards that, a political reading of the times that they were in.
I think the reason I'm asking that question as well is because I think I can't speak for everybody's family, but certainly in a lot of families that I've known, there's always been that smoking, drinking woman in the family. And we have all kinds of names for them, but we're going to call them Sisters Killjoy in this instance, people who just don't follow the social norms. And I don't think there's always been a clear cut that they've been ostracized. but rather sometimes accepted for who they were, but also envied for who they could be. And sometimes I wonder if popular culture and cultural forms, creative forms, have been slow on the uptake of these women. And it's not to say that they haven't been, but they've been exceptionalized in creative forms. To, you know, whether it's in Sula with Toni Morrison and those two figures or whatever, but that actually all of our, I think most of our families have that person, or have that person in the community, or several people like that. So I think the question is also around, yeah, these kind of creative forms.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, thanks for mentioning that. Women's ejaculating is P. And for me, like, you made me think about this erotic scholar, Helen Hester. She's from the UK, and she wrote The Displacement of Sex. And I remember encountering that book and just seeing how the law plays a huge role in how we think about sex, but also in how because what's centered then becomes a taboo. Something like if a woman is ejaculating, then it is taboo. And it's been interesting in how it's been feminists who've been always doing that work of agency around sexuality, but also around sex, like from the sex wars debating from the 70s, anti-porn, pro-porn, sex radicals, and then now porn studies. For me, it's how the law, if the law is patriarchal itself, it will even influence in how we think about sex agency. And just to speak about the South African context, I remember just thinking about, because I came across a lot of debates on pornography, but they were very United States based. And I'm writing as a South African, I'm a PhD scholar in South Africa, and I remember just like trying to see what the feminists have done around pornography, around racism in South Africa. And the first encounter was very centered around the Films and Publications Act of 1996, when there was a transition between Nationalist Party and the ANC, and there were those discussions around what could be accepted as porn, as morality in society, and there was those debates around, others were like anti-porn, others were pro-porn. And for me, it was very interesting in how it's feminists again who are doing that work of ensuring that we think about ways to practice sex that is satisfactory not just to the males but to the females. And that for me, I started thinking about how the law itself, if it's patriarchal, then it can even influences about the ways we think about sex and pleasure. Yeah. So I was just saying, like, thanks for bringing that up, and you made me think about this writer as well, who has done very great work in around how law can play a part in sort of denying women sexual pleasure. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. You can also lead it into concluding remarks.
No, I was just gonna share my own experience, because I really like what you said about basically experimentation in writing and the narrative of having men, which is always dominating, right? Because I remember picking up the book at the library. Actually, it was discontinued, so I just picked it from the shelves where they say the books are for free, and it's only when I got home that I realized it was basically Head's book. But in fact, for a long time it was sitting there. I was looking at the cover of the book, and then I started reading the book, and I couldn't get through the text, so I put it away. And then I looked at the cover again and again. I went to the book again, and I couldn't read. I think I only got through it the third time when I was like, okay, maybe it's challenging me. It's not like any other novel, So when you speak about, experimentation, form, excitement of people's imagination, I mean, that image, the book cover for me does that,
It's very colorful, but there's also something that is, like these arrows are pointing to the mind, so it's like messing up your mind at the same time. So I really enjoyed, I don't know, the cover of the book. I don't know, when you guys write, do you ever consider, you know, the visual aspects of the choice that the author makes in terms of if it really starts there or it ends there? Who knows? I'm a visual artist. My background is in visual arts. That's the first one.
Yeah, I think you can respond.
Yeah, Bessie Head is very difficult, and I think that's why I chose it for my PhD work. I mean, Equation of Power, I've read it so many times, and every time I go back, I'm like, how did I miss this? And then the fourth time, and the 15th, I read it so many times. It's a very challenging text, and I think it's those experimentations that happen that draw me to the text, because it's not like your typical conventional writing of you do the setting and then try and create conflict and then there's some resolution and then it's this happy ending or this satisfying ending, but it's just jumbling of so many ideas, but still being relevant to the politics of race as a colored woman, like how she has never felt like she belonged either to the blacks or the whites, and she tried to be in some movements that were never that could never succeed until she felt like she had to leave. So you get those conversations around gender as well, and as you were saying that the characters, she loved male characters, and she's always like in a way speaking about patriarchy by always showing you this evil, because even Silo in the Equation of Power, Silo is this character who sees himself as God, as even more than God, and then at the same time is always whispering nasty things to Elizabeth that are inferior. So I like how she experiments with allegory, but not necessarily making you as a reader feel like Elizabeth is saying these things, but using the male characters to showcase prejudices that we all experience as women. Yeah.
Last one, Nadine. Last one. I swear, last one. Quick, very quick.
Okay, so there are two very quick questions.
I just wanted to, I don't know if you know that the practice of kunyaza, that's in Rwanda, so it's around female ejaculation and multiple orgasms that's taught from woman to woman. There's also a documentary on that as well, but it's interesting because again there was a queen that actually, sort of experimented with this technique with people, so yeah, it's cool.
Okay, mine's just sort of a comment, not a question. It's really interesting, the kind of innovative thing we're doing with Bessie Behr, because in my country there's this politics of old text versus new text, contemporary texts. There's this version people have, for all the scholars, when you're talking about Achebe's things, we're like, oh, that's been overflowed, Bessie Behr, that's too old, new text, but, seeing this perspective, innovation that you're bringing into freshness, some kind of fresh air, it's quite fascinating, so thank you.
Okay, on that note, I think her stories are always a breath of fresh air, so thank you for sharing these.
Then I was also sorry, I was supposed to give you there's some intersections of masculinity, talking about patriarchy, in your reading of the text. If you find intersections, patriarchal structures and masculinity. Thank you.
Thank you.